What's the first thing we notice about people we meet? It's so automatic, we usually don't even notice we're doing it. We read them as male or female, and what they're wearing, maybe along with their gait and body shape, is our main reference in decoding their gender. In this section, we're going to focus on how gender has been constructed through dress and how what is considered to be feminine and masculine changes through time and cultural context. I also want to make the point that femininity and masculinity needs to be understood in relation to each other and as a continuum. They don't exist independently as objective categories. Gender theorists and feminist scholars argue that there's no direct correlation between having a penis and being so-called masculine. Instead, we develop our gender identity and the associated qualities of masculinity and femininity through our social interactions. You can find out more detail about this in the article Masculinity, Femininity from the Encyclopedia of Sociology. To help illustrate my points, I'm going to look back in two ways. Historically, how gender has been expressed in dress, but also how gender is inscribed on us from when we are born, even before. It is now common for parents to discover the gender of their child even before the birth. In fact, it just so happens that this morning I'm waiting for my sister to give birth to a baby girl. She hasn't arrived yet, but we already know what pronoun to give her. Parents typically find out the gender of their child so that they can prepare the right kind of environment for their gender. In our culture, it tends to be blue for boys and pink for girls, and this seems innocent enough. But think of the enormous implications of this. From even before the human enters the world, their biological sex shapes their environment in profound ways. So, by the way, this is not a photo of my sister in my niece's bedroom. It's actually quite difficult to tell the difference, if we go back to the previous photo, in sex between male and female babies, and we tend to be very anxious about getting it wrong. And I think it's interesting in itself that we find this error so socially awkward. To help us, we have enlisted the use of design so that in contemporary Western culture, everyone has learned that a baby dressed in blue is likely a boy and a baby dressed in pink is probably a girl. We take this so for granted that it's difficult to conceive that this colour distinction is actually quite recent. So the fashion historian Jo Paoletti, in her history of gender difference in children's clothing, quotes a 1918 department store catalogue which advised that the generally accepted rule is pink for the boys and blue for the girls. The reason is that pink, being a more decided and stronger colour, is more suitable for the boy, while blue, which is more delicate and dainty, is prettier for the girl. The quote shows that 100 years ago, they were no less concerned about creating a gender distinction, but that our particular distinction of blue for boys and pink for girls is arbitrary and not inherent in the optic and aesthetic qualities of the colour itself or how it aligns to our sex. So girls are socialised into pink as the appropriate colour to perform conventional female gender identity. But just because it's culturally constructed, it doesn't mean it's not incredibly powerful. And this is why I would argue it's so important to challenge and deconstruct those gender stereotypes. But let's go back, so 250, 300 years, and consider how these distinctions developed in the first place. So during the first part of the 18th century, the main function of dress was to communicate social status, so your wealth and power. And when you look at paintings from this era, men are as likely to wear fabrics such as lace, velvet and satin, ostentatious jewellery, makeup, wigs and so on, as the women are. However, there were new cultural and political ideas emerging, which questioned the right of the elite's absolute power. So these ideas, which led to the French Revolution, meant that the overt display of wealth and power through male dress became increasingly taboo. I will go into this in more detail in a later session, But the consequence was that an interest in decorative fashion was seen as feminine or effeminate, and a sign of weakness of intellect and moral judgment. I think this is epitomised in the vilification of Marie Antoinette, as you know, who was beheaded at the height of the French Revolution. The historian John Harvey, in his book Men in Black, argues that this painting, so a few decades later, in the beginning of the 19th century, gives it a kind of indication of the directions of men's fashion and that was taken from the early 19th century onwards. So what do you first notice about the dress depicted in this painting? I would say it's most obviously to do with colour, that the men are primarily in black and dark colours, and women, particularly the younger ones, in light colours. Further, what distinguishes male and female dress and deportment? It feels like the male dress appears more solid and rigid, upright, whereas the fabrics worn by the women are soft, transparent and fluid. And this is also echoed in their gesture, sort of delicate and reverent of the men in the room. The visual distinction between male and female dress then becomes increasingly pronounced during the 19th century. The fashion historian Elizabeth Wilson writes that by the early 19th century, women's role in society was narrowing. Dress began to distinguish gender in more exaggerated ways. Woman and costume together created femininity. By the early Victorian period, a ballet dancer fragility of looks was fashionable for women. Their whole style trembled with meek submissiveness. And this divergence between the sexes was about gender as much as eroticism. So the silhouette of the dress, the hourglass shape, exaggerates the shape of the bust, the waist and hips, and emphasises women's difference to men, and makes this difference also seem obvious and natural, despite it actually being a very complicated silhouette to achieve. And in a later session, we'll probably go and look at some of the 19th century underwear, like bustles and crinolines and corsetry, that was used to achieve this silhouette. As you may be aware, there was a growing movement calling for women's rights, first and foremost the right to vote. The movement for women's suffrage gained momentum towards the end of the 19th century and increasingly at the start of the 20th century. And this movement sought to overturn what many consider to be the natural gender distinction, that women were, by the nature of their sex, inferior to men, particularly in intellect, and could therefore not enjoy the same rights and privileges, such as the right to vote or run for political office, or even be educated at university. For many feminists at the time, women's suppression was also manifest in fashion. So the tight corsets, impractical crinolines and bustles, voluminous skirts, all served to curtail women's participation in public life. Again, because of this association between fashion, frivolity and femininity, some sought to distance themselves from fashion by adopting more alternative styles, often influenced by men's tailoring or more bohemian dress of the arts and crafts movement. The increasing popularity of recreational sports such as cycling also had a major influence on fashion, developing the fashion for bloomers, for example. However, these forms of dress became an opportunity for the anti-suffrage movement, so those who opposed women's suffrage, to mock them. So here is an example, and you'll find lots of similar ones, of an anti-suffrage postcard, which here articulates the moral panic at the time of what this dangerous movement could lead to. So here we have a woman going out wearing trousers and leaving her husband at home to mind the baby. Imagine. So the British suffrage movement, spearheaded by the Pankhurst, as you probably know already, took a very different tactic, however. Rather than disdain fashion, the Pankhurst openly embraced it and encouraged their followers to campaign in what they call their smartest attire. I will go into this in more detail in a later session, but this portrait of the militant suffragette Christabel Pankhurst from 1909 presents her as unquestionably feminine in a full-length white satin gown. There is no contradiction, they argued, between women's liberation and fashion. So it's not the white satin which is the source of her oppression, but the ideology of male supremacy. Interestingly, the suffragettes constructed a vision of womanhood where the perceived masculine traits necessary for the public campaigns, so violent disorder and physical and mental endurance, was entirely compatible with fashionable and feminine dress. Yet, women's dress in the 20th century has undergone drastic changes, to the point where a Victorian time traveller would in many contexts struggle to identify our gender through what we wear. Clearly something has changed from the extreme gender distinction in Victorian and Edwardian dress to what we see today. And one of the key motivators for this change, there are many factors clearly, but it's been women's participation in work. During the start of the 20th century, particularly during World War I, when women took an active role in the war effort, and which also again helped them to secure the vote after the war. This tongue-in-cheek quote is taken from a 1916 article from The Guardian discussing the issue of what to wear to work in the factories where women had taken on previously male jobs. So, as for the hat, it can on this occasion only be said that it should be small and, if possible, as invulnerable as the tanks. For it is impossible that the buildings designed for the occupation of men should provide any side shelter for feminine millinery. Again, during World War II, women's dress took on elements of men's fashion. So tailoring with sharp shoulders, straight hips, gave women a professional appearance which suited society's need for their labour. So these women striding down the streets of London in 1941 are clearly not unconcerned with style. I think they look very stylish. But it's quite easy to read their gender, yet their appearance suggests that the function of their dress is to communicate professionalism as much as femininity. After the war, however, there was a perceived need for women to return to the home, as men returning from the war needed their jobs back. Many historians see the parallels between the return of the housewife as a feminine ideal and post-war fashion's extreme femininity, inspired by mid-Victorian fashion. But which follows which? It could be a kind of chicken and egg question. It is difficult to put the blame on fashion for society's gender distinctions, but undeniably fashion has played a part in reinforcing them. I mainly focus on how femininity is constructed through women's dress, but the monotony of men's dress is also evidence of how gender roles are confining and restricting. We need only go into the children's section of any high street chain to see that the selection of clothing for boys is typically half of that of girls. As a mother of boys myself, this journalist experience very much resonates with me. And I'm just going to read it out loud so you don't have to read it yourself. When I asked my 8-year-old son what he would like to wear to a forthcoming wedding, his response was clear and immediate. A red suit with white spots, a matching hat and gold shoes. This seemed fair enough to me. Who in their right mind would not want to wear such a fabulous outfit? We set off for our local shopping centre in high spirits. And yet, within an hour of hitting the high street, depression had set in. There is a unique kind of misery to be found in an 8 to 14-year-old boys' clothing section. Rail upon rail of sludge green, grey, and my son's personal nemesis, navy blue. He tried on one hideous Jacob Rees-Mogg style blazer after another. It makes me look like a businessman, he said, examining the stiff, uncomfortable kid in the mirror. In an entire morning, we found not one item of clothing that was interesting, not one that expressed even the tiniest iota of individuality or creativity. Fortunately, we now have other options. After a reviving bun in the local cafe, my son and I went home and hit the internet. And there, readers, we found a happy ending. An outfit so outrageous, so loud and silly and glorious that there was simply no way to resist. So, to conclude, what is not this but a call to designers everywhere to inject our creativity into fashion? So that no matter where on the gender spectrum we find ourselves and how we choose to express our definition of masculinity and femininity and everything in between, we can find clothes that fit our identity and our body.